Welcome everybody. This is our week 2 overview lecture. And what you're going to see from this lecture is my intent to really use my lectures as supplements to the reading. So in other words, I want to expand on what the reading has to say, and I want to present possibly another way of looking at the reading. But of course, it's incumbent upon you as the student to complete the reading. And that means the very last thing we do with the reading during this week and each week of the course is that the discussion is the last springboard we use to complete your understanding of the reading. And then starting in week 3, next week, we will expand even more by using a reflective journal. And that reflective journal, as we know from our review of the syllabus, is going to occur just about every other week, not every week itself. So about 5 times during the rest of the semester, starting at week 3. But this week, I want to take a look at framing public administration eras through the lens of public employment. And this is a unique device to talk about eras of public administration, to kind of set up and contextualize the Goodnow and the Wilson readings that I assigned for you this week. So let's get right into that. So first of all, I have a little parenthetical note up there that says much of this discussion is based on Rosenblum 2014 and on the Wilson and Goodnow readings. So I will reference these readings throughout this presentation, and I'll also reference a few other readings. And you'll note at the very end of the presentation, when I get there, you'll see reference pages, and those will be useful to you as well. But the Rosenblum piece, if you look on Blackboard, you see I assigned that as an optional reading. It's really just one chapter of a book by Rosenblum, but it's a pretty good concise reading to help you a little bit with framing public administration eras. And I'll say right at the outset that I don't necessarily agree with the eras that they present. I think they simplify them a little bit, but that's okay at this point to be a little simplistic about it, because it helps us to contextualize Wilson and Goodnow. So, you know, Woodrow Wilson is often looked upon as the father of public administration, and his 1887 reading on the science of administration is just about standard fare for any Master of Public Administration program. It's important for all MPA students to have read this work, because this work has been looked upon as something like a founding document for the academic discipline of public administration. Often left out of that mix is the work by Goodnow, and what I assigned you this week from Goodnow was a couple chapters of a book he wrote in 1900. Well, both Wilson and Goodnow have a lot to say about the of administration as a separate, almost a separate constitutional branch of government. So if we think of, you know, the classic separation of powers in the Constitution of the executive, the legislative, and the judiciary, you know, both Wilson and Goodnow set up administration really as a fourth separate branch, and each refers to a version of something we call the politics administration dichotomy. So what is this politics administration dichotomy, which is actually a very much used term in public administration? But what is it? This is Wilson in the 1887 work. He says administrative questions are not political questions. Although politics sets the tasks for administration, it should not be suffered to manipulate its offices. And then he says it is clearing the moral atmosphere of official life by establishing the sanctity of public office as a public trust, and by making the service unpartisan, it is opening the way for making it businesslike. So what he's saying here is that the administration of government policy should be conducted by people who are nonpartisan. More on that in just a minute here. Well, this is Goodnow from the readings that I assigned. And Goodnow says in 1900, he's saying, the fact is then that there is a large part of administration which is unconnected with politics, which should therefore be relieved very largely, if not altogether, from the control of political bodies. And he also says the governmental authorities entrusted with the discharge of the administrative function should not only, like judges, be free from the influence of politics, they should also, again like judges, have considerable permanence of tenure. They should have permanence of tenure because the excellence of their work is often conditioned by the fact that they are expert, and expertness comes from long practice. So, in these readings, both Wilson and Goodnow are saying that politics and administration should be separate. Well, if you're following along here, there's a question that should be begged in your mind, and that is, what do they mean by politics, and what do they mean by administration? And I'm saving that question in abeyance for a bit because I want us to explore that more in the discussion this week. The meanings of those words, politics and administration, and whether or not these two things are separable, even in philosophically, and if they are separable in fact. So for most of the rest of this discussion, what I want to do is I want to refer to this Rosenblum optional reading, this book, and what I've given you on the Blackboard site is a PDF of chapter 1, the intro chapter of his book. And what he does in this intro chapter is he talks about civil service employment, and mostly related to federal civil service employment, not really related to state or local civil service employment, but mostly related to federal civil service employment. And he uses the device of comparing how that worked with eras of public administration. And so I'm borrowing heavily from the Rosenblum book in framing this slide presentation. So first of all, Rosenblum talks about a period after the early founding of the Republic. So the Constitution was ratified in 1789 after it had been written in 1787. And he says that in terms of the people who worked in administration of government, not to say elected leaders, but the people who worked in administration of the federal government from about 1789 to 1829, so roughly the first 50 years or so of the founding of the Republic, he says it's characterized by elite domination. That administrators are people who are of a certain social class. They may have connections to the founding fathers. In fact, they have kinship. They have technical abilities, but these abilities are based primarily on class. So you can imagine that most of the people working in federal government are probably of the Eastern elite class. Remember the founding of the United States in the 1770s and 1780s. The United States itself was really confined to the Eastern Seaboard, and many of the elites were also people who we often consider among the founders. So it was this class of people that were working in government, according to Rosenblum. And sometimes federal employment was often considered private property, kind of like a sinecure, that more or less English word, with positions sometimes informally bequeathed to heirs. And this persisted, according to Rosenblum again, until the era of Jackson. And why did this persist? Well, really, if you think about it, it's because government itself, the federal government in particular, was quite small for about that 50 years. The nation was starting to expand during that 50 years. In fact, it expanded greatly to about, to the Louisiana Purchase area. Most of what constituted the Louisiana Purchase, however, was unsettled, and so the real settlement continued to about the Mississippi River by the end of that period. But still, most of the operation of government was an eastern seaboard kind of concern until the era of Andrew Jackson. And let's get to that. And so, if you remember from junior high or high school civics, Andrew Jackson, President Andrew Jackson, is noted for a couple of things, and a couple of things that are not very complimentary to him. In fact, Andrew Jackson launched what is called the Trail of Tears, which was the forced migration of Native Americans from the Carolinas to the Oklahoma territory. He's also known as the first Westerner elected to the office of presidency. He was born in the state of Tennessee. Previous to Jackson, all other presidents had been born in the East, many of them in Virginia and some in New England. So Jackson is an outsider in a sense. He's a Westerner, but Jackson is also known as the person who really advocated for something he called the spoils system, and he is quoted as saying, "To the victor goes the spoils." Jackson saw federal government employment as an arm of the current ruling political party, and he saw that actually as a hallmark of democracy, whereby incoming presidents would select not only members of the cabinet, the Secretary of War, the Secretary of State, the Postmaster General, people like that, but all kinds of offices. And that every 4 years, essentially, if a new president was elected every 4 years, all kinds of positions would be vacated and refilled with people of favor to the incoming political party. There's a really fascinating historical study by Harrold, who is a noted Lincoln historian, and he wrote this book in 2009 called Lincoln President-Elect. He spends a great deal of time in that book talking about how during a crisis, right after Lincoln was elected, southern states began seceding from the Union, and by the time Lincoln even became president, I think 7 states had seceded. Lincoln spent a great deal of his time, many weeks and months of his president-elect time from November through February, having people buttonhole him and come to his office asking for federal positions. Tariff official, customs official, postmaster general at various locations. And this was quite common for presidents to actually do the selection of these kinds of officials. It was part of the spoils system. And so what historians also talk about is this symbiotic relationship between parties and appointed office holders. So this was the beginning at the local and state levels, really, of what we have come to recognize as machine politics. People would gain office by promising jobs in cities to people. So, for example, at a city level, they would provide you a job picking up the trash or lighting the street lamps in exchange, literally, for votes. And so this was the beginning of machine politics, this kind of spoils system in the United States. And so what you can see at the bottom there, this rapidly expanding nation, there's a growth of positions in the federal government, and administration becomes tied directly to electoral politics. And so we have this limited concept of professional administration. What do we mean by administration? And Andrew Jackson had said, all federal jobs are so easy and basic that anyone can do them. So therefore, I should be able to appoint literally anyone I want. So there was no sense of job qualification. It was simply a political favor. That really describes the spoils system, which persisted through about the 1880s. Well, in 1883, a very important law was passed called the Civil Service Reform Act, the Pendleton Act, it's also known as. And this created in 1883 the first U.S. Civil Service Commission. Again, this is applicable only to federal jobs. But so what this law was trying to do was limit the influence of these so-called spoilsmen, people who gained jobs simply because of their political connections or sought jobs simply because of their political connections to elected officials, specifically the president. And so instead of getting a job because of connections, this law carried with it the idea that you should have qualifications for the job, that you should pass some kind of test to see if you're qualified for the job. And so this era, this wasn't just an act. This actually is the era in which Goodnow and Wilson are writing. This era of reform. And so here Rosenblum talks about the era of civil service reform. But as we get more into our course, this is also an era known as the progressive era. And so during the progressive era, what we see is a push for government reform in a lot of different areas. It's not just civil service reform. For example, we see the beginnings of retirement systems for government employees. In 1920, the first Federal Civil Service-wide Retirement Act was passed in 1920. At state and local levels, we're starting to see the beginnings of career public employees. And, for example, we're starting to see the first retirement systems for K-12 teachers. We see the first retirement system during this era for military officers primarily. And so what's happening during this era is we're seeing the beginnings of this politics administration dichotomy that Wilson and Goodnow really were advocating. And what we're seeing is the rise in a so-called professional administrative force. Later in the course, we're going to talk about Frederick Taylor and scientific management. But that's the idea that jobs in a bureaucracy, and jobs anywhere really, can be filled by one best qualified man, and that was the term man that Taylor used, and that there's one best way to do a job. And so this idea that scientific management was replacing this kind of buddy system of the spoils system. We see other growth in reforms. So for example, in 1921, the Budget and Accounting Act was passed. You're going to learn way more about that when you take the public budgeting class, but basically what that act did was implement what we know as executive budgeting at the federal government level, meaning that the president's actually in charge of proposing a consolidated budget to Congress, and that wasn't the case before 1921. But centralization, even during this period, was still uneven. I cite a couple sources there, Scotchpall and Orloff. What they're really talking about is the Civil War pension system, the pension system that was implemented for veterans of the Civil War. It was really a system based in patronage and based in political connections for the most part. And so even during this period of reform, there were still these remnants of a system based in favoritism. And then Rosenblum talks about the extension of the presidency, and really what he's talking about here is the New Deal presidency of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So we know that during this time, the federal government greatly expanded because Roosevelt expanded the size and scope of the federal government, and it grew from about 600,000 employees to about 4 million employees. And so really what Roosevelt was doing was reasserting the role of the presidency. It wasn't necessarily a spoils system. Part of Roosevelt's effort was bringing in experts into the federal government. So for example, I down there at the bottom you see that the people that really innovated Social Security, which occurred during the presidency of FDR, were professors at Wisconsin University and some professors from Ohio State University who developed Social Security. And many of them stayed on and worked in the federal government as experts. And we know that this was the beginning of the so-called welfare state with a simultaneous growth in defense. Defense grew as a result of World War II, obviously, but it never really shrank post-World War II to the extent that the military had shrank after previous wars. And so during this time, we learn about this thing called the Brownlow Committee, which led to the creation of the Executive Office of the President during the presidency of Roosevelt. We're going to talk more about the Brownlow Committee in a couple of weeks, but ultimately that the Brownlow Committee and the Executive Office of the President led to the creation of present-day organizations such as the Office of Personnel Management and the Office of Management and Budget, which are under the Executive Office of the President. So if you are a federal employee, the rule making for federal employees all occur at the presidential level. That doesn't mean Congress doesn't have a hand in the rule making. They do have a hand in writing laws for the federal civil service, but the actual administration of civil service is done at the office of the president level. So what we're seeing during this period in terms of administration is this trend towards centralization, and how employees are handled is part of this trend towards centralization in administration. And then Rosenblum talks about the era of heterodoxy from 1933 to 1993. There's a lot of disagreement that this whole era of heterodoxy is that long. You're going to see that in the Stillman work that we talk about next week in week 3. But at any rate, for our purposes here, this is simplified enough to talk about this. But what we're seeing during this period is this demise of this politics administrative dichotomy. And so does that mean that administrators are directly and heavily involved in electoral politics? Not necessarily. In fact, there are strictures against employees being involved in electoral politics. But of course, electoral politics aren't the only kind of politics. There's the politics of policy. And so what we're seeing during this time is that administrators have an active hand in the creation of policy, not simply policy implementation. And we see this really to this day, that administrators do work with Congress. They work with appointed officials to actually develop policy and regulations. And so it's called heterodoxy because it's tough to figure out. There's no overriding orthodoxy ruling how we look at public administration. But again, what we're seeing during this period is a growth of presidential domination of administration and a continuation of the welfare state and a growth in defense. And so finally, Rosenblum talks about the era of reinventing government and collaborative governance. Again, a lot of people would break those up into 2 eras, but it's okay for right now. What in the 90s, what we saw was, if you ever read Reinventing Government by Osborne and Gabler in 1993, that was the basis of President Clinton's much ballyhooed attempt at reinventing the federal government, and he put Vice President Al Gore in charge of that. In week 10, we're going to read a short article by Al Gore. And he talked about the government steering, not rowing, which is a reinventing term. And basically what that means is that what's important in federal civil service or in government in general is the idea that people in government steer, they direct how the outcomes should be formed, but they don't necessarily dictate the particular ways that the outcomes should come about. So what we see is a blending of sectors emphasizing outcomes, and that really is kind of what Osborne and Gabler were talking about in Reinventing Government. Whatever the method is that we can get to prescribed outcomes, that's what we should do. The most efficient or effective method, whether that be contracting out, whether that be having government employees do the work, whether that be vouchers, we should look for the most effective device to find the outcomes we're looking for. And really this leads to where we're at today, which is what many scholars point to, an era of collaboration and networking in governments, leading to the blurring of lines between levels of government and sectors providing government services. You see that I say Edward Snowden. Most of you know who Edward Snowden is. Edward Snowden was a man who was a whistleblower and said, in his view, that the NSA was, the National Security Administration was agency, I should say, National Security Agency, which is an agency of the Department of Defense, was spying on American citizens. So that was Edward Snowden's contention. He continues to contend that, living in exile in Russia. And so it doesn't really matter what you believe of what Edward Snowden says or doesn't say. What the point I want to make is that Edward Snowden was a contractor employee. He wasn't even really a government employee. He was working for a contractor that was working for the NSA. And so there's this blurring of what is government work and what is private work, and do the sectors blur? And so that has the implication of the question, so what does it mean to be a public servant? And we're going to get to this thread of thought by Denhart and Denhart in about week 14 or 15, I think. But so all of this talk of how government employees get hired and fired, how they're judged, really brings us full circle to the context in which Wilson and Goodnow were writing. So in historical context, in 1887 and in 1900, what were Wilson and Goodnow talking about? Wilson said famously that it's getting harder to run a constitution than to frame one. He said that in 1887. And what he meant was the Constitution, as this written document, didn't necessarily tell us how we should run or operate the government of the United States. That was his overriding question, his overriding concern. Goodnow talked about administration being akin to the judiciary. And so therefore, is there or should there be this dichotomy, if you will, between politics and administration? And again, as I mentioned at the top of this presentation, what is it we mean by politics and what is it that we mean by administration? And so ultimately, what were Wilson and Goodnow opposing and what were they advocating? And so this brings me to this final slide for this week. The readings are assigned, as you know, so what I want to do with these readings after you get through them is I want us to participate in a post-question respond discussion board. And we've talked about what I mean by this, that I pose a question, each of you posts a response, and then as peers to each other, you're going to write questions back to each other or critiques back to each other, and then I want you to come back and respond to those questions or critiques. On the discussion board, I have due dates for each part of this post question respond format. And so the second thing I want you to do this week, we're already in week 2, and the semesters do fly by. I want you to start exploring what you plan to propose for your term project. By this time, hopefully you've read the syllabus and you should be thinking about this. What I'd like to encourage you to do is to email me in advance with your questions. You don't have to think about your proposal just the day before it's due. You can be thinking about it, mulling it over in your own mind. I welcome email questions about this before the proposal, and I'll be happy to go back and forth on your thoughts about your proposal with you. So that's what we're doing for this week. And I want to talk about the references just for a second, because I have something I want to say about references. So you note here on this slide and on the next slide, I do talk about all the references I used in my presentation today. And I'm doing that for a very specific reason, and that is as you go through these readings, one of the things you'll want to be doing is you'll want to be looking at the references that the authors themselves use. Goodnow and Wilson, not so much. They don't use that many references, but you know, most of the readings that I assign on a weekly basis have just a whole list of references. And so what those references are good for is helping you actually find good sources for your term project. So when you look at a reading, always spend some time looking at the references and understand that those references are really a great starting place when you're developing a term project. So that is my presentation for this week. I'm looking forward to the give and take on the discussion board for this week. Please do email me your questions as you have them on anything concerning the class. Thanks very much. Have a good week.